The door of the farmhouse closed with a sound as flat and final as a stone dropping into a deep well. It was a sound that separated one life from the next. Outside, the air was ablaze. December 1st, 1889. The temperature had been falling for a week, a slow, methodical tightening of nature's grip on the high plains of Wyoming. Inside the man's thin coat, two small bodies huddled against him, seeking a warmth he no longer possessed. Anna, his daughter, was 9, her face pressed into his side, her shoulders trembling. Ben, his son, was 8, holding his father's hand with a grip so tight it ached. Thomas looked down at them, their breath pluming in the frigid air, and then back at the solid wood of the door. Behind it was the only home they had ever known. Behind it was Marcus, his brother-in-law, a man whose heart had grown as hard and barren as the winter ground. "Your notions are a poison here, Thomas," Marcus had said, his voice low and devoid of heat. "Reading those books, scratching at rocks, talking about water under the ground. It's unnatural. It spooks the livestock and it spooks the neighbors. My Helen, your own wife's sister, she can't bear the whispers anymore." Thomas had said nothing. There was nothing to say that hadn't been said before. His fascination with the earth's hidden engines was, to them, a kind of madness, a distraction from the righteous, back-breaking labor of farming. He was a widower, a guest in his own former home, and his strangeness had become a burden too heavy for their narrow world to carry. "The council agrees," Marcus had concluded, sealing the verdict. "You have until sunrise," and so they had left, with a canvas sack containing a loaf of bread, a half-wheel of cheese, a hatchet, a whetstone, and a worn book on geology. For his daughter, he had taken the last thing he had of his wife's, a heavy, dark blue woolen scarf, which he now wrapped twice around Anna's neck. For his son, a pair of his own thickest wool socks, pulled over the boy's worn boots. He turned his back on the house and faced the vast, unforgiving expanse of white. There was no road, only the suggestion of a trail leading toward the stony ridges that clawed at the horizon. It was a place no one went. A place of wind and rock and nothing more. It was, he knew, a death sentence delivered with a veneer of Christian charity. They had not cast him out into the snow, they had simply opened the door and let the wilderness do its work. The first shelter was a betrayal. A shallow overhang of rock that promised protection but offered only a focused misery, channeling the wind into a knife's edge that seemed to seek out the seams of their clothes. For 3 days, they huddled there, a small knot of fading warmth against an infinite cold. Sleep was not a refuge but a danger, a siren call to surrender that Thomas had to fight with every fiber of his being. He would sit with his back to the rock, the children cocooned between him and the small, sputtering fire that consumed their scavenged wood with a desperate hunger. He fed it twigs and branches he snapped from the low-hanging limbs of stunted pines, his fingers growing numb and clumsy in the process. The work was constant. Melt snow for water. Ration the bread and cheese into impossibly small portions that seemed to vanish on the tongue, leaving only a more profound emptiness behind. He would watch Anna and Ben, their faces pale and smudged with soot, their eyes large and quiet. They did not complain. Their silence was a heavier burden than any cry would have been. It was the silence of trust, absolute and terrifying. They believed he could fix this. They believed he had a plan. And in the darkest hours, when the fire burned low and the howl of the wind sounded like a predator circling just beyond the light, he was not so sure. He felt the ghost of his wife beside him, a presence as real as the cold. He had failed her. He had let her family, her own sister, cast her children out to die. The shame was a physical thing, a cold sickness in his gut that the fire could not touch. He fought it the only way he knew how, with methodical action. He would check the children's hands and feet for the telltale white of frostbite. He would force them to drink the lukewarm water. He would tell them stories of the world beneath their feet, of rivers of molten rock and mountains pushed up by the slow, patient power of the earth. It was all he had left. His strange notions. They were not a poison. They were an anchor, the only thing keeping his mind from fracturing under the weight of his failure. On the 4th day, he knew the overhang would not hold them. The wood was growing scarce, and the cold was deepening, settling into the very marrow of the world. He had to move. He had to find something better, or they would be found in the spring, frozen into a single, tragic sculpture of despair. He left the children huddled by the fire, wrapped in their single shared blanket, with a stern command not to move. "I am going to the creek," he told them, his voice rough. "I will not be long. Keep the fire small, but do not let it die." He walked with his head down, following the logic of the land. Water meant life. It meant trees for fuel and shelter. The creek he found was mostly frozen, a ribbon of milky ice winding through the rocks. But in some places, the ice was thin, and in others, it was gone entirely, revealing a current of dark, shockingly clear water. This was unusual. At this temperature, the creek should have been solid. His curiosity, the very trait that had led to his exile, sparked to life. It was a small, defiant flame in the vast cold of his fear. He followed the patches of open water, his eye scanning not the banks, but the rocks themselves. He saw what others would have missed, a faint, rust-colored staining on the granite, a powdery deposit of minerals that spoke of something other than snowmelt. He knelt, his bare hand hovering over a fissure in a large, flat stone near the water's edge. The rock was cold, as expected. But from the crack, a faint, almost imperceptible warmth radiated. It was nothing. A trick of the mind. He pressed on, moving upstream, the strange feeling of hope warring with a deeper, more ingrained pragmatism. Then he saw it. A patch of ground, perhaps 6 feet across, where no snow lay. The earth was dark and damp, and from its center, a delicate wisp of steam rose into the air, a ghostly exhalation from the planet itself. He stumbled forward, falling to his knees beside it. He held his hands over the fissure in the ground. It was real. A steady, gentle current of warm, moist air, smelling of sulfur and wet earth. It was a hot spring. A hidden artery of the world's own warmth, bleeding out onto this frozen, desolate ridge. For a long moment, Thomas did not move. He simply knelt there, his hands outstretched as if in prayer, letting the impossible heat seep into his frozen skin. It was more than warmth. It was a refutation of everything he had just endured. It was a sign. The world was not empty and cruel. It was full of secrets, of hidden systems, of power available to anyone with the eyes to see it. He looked up at the grey, oppressive sky, and for the first time in days, he felt not its weight, but its distance. He was no longer a victim of the surface. He had found the engine room. The idea that bloomed in his mind was immediate and absolute. It wasn't enough to camp beside the spring. They couldn't live exposed, huddled around a single vent of steam. He had to capture the heat. He had to build a shelter over it. He raced back to the children, his heart pounding with a purpose that felt like a resurrection. He found them exactly as he had left them, 2 small, still figures by a dying fire. The relief that washed over him was dizzying. "We are moving," he announced, his voice ringing with a strange new authority. "Pack what you can. We have found our home." The spot he chose was a small, level patch of ground directly over the network of fissures. The main vent would be their hearth, their furnace, their reason for being. The work that followed was brutal, a relentless assault on the frozen wilderness and his own physical limits. He had only the hatchet and his hands. He felled lodgepole pines, their slim trunks straight and true, the rhythmic thud of his axe the only sound for miles. The cold was a constant thief, stealing the heat from his muscles, making the axe handle slick and treacherous. Each tree was a victory. He would spend hours trimming the branches, cutting the logs to length, his breath rasping in his chest. He dragged them one by one to the building site, his boots sinking in the snow, his body screaming with the effort. He was not a carpenter, but he was a patient man who understood systems. He had seen cabins raised before. He knew the logic of saddle notching the corners, of laying the logs in an interlocking pattern that gave the structure its strength. His first few notches were clumsy, ugly things, but he learned. He used the hatchet with a surgeon's care, shaving away the wood until the logs nested together, not perfectly, but well enough. Anna and Ben became his crew. They gathered stones from the creek bed, their small hands red and raw, and piled them near the main vent. They collected moss from the north side of trees, stuffing it into a sack to be used for chinking the gaps between the logs. They were no longer just survivors, they were builders. The shared purpose gave them a new light. They watched their father, this quiet, strange man, transform the world around them through sheer will and effort. They saw the walls rise, one log at a time. They saw a home being born from nothing. The cabin rose slowly, a testament to relentless, incremental progress. It was a small, square structure, barely 12 feet on a side, with a low, sloping roof he fashioned from overlapping layers of pine boughs covered in packed earth and snow. It was crude, but it was solid. The final, most critical piece was the floor. He couldn't leave the damp earth exposed. He spent a week splitting logs lengthwise with wedges and the back of his hatchet, a punishing task that left his hands blistered and bleeding. He laid these rough-hewn planks, the puncheons, across sleeper logs, leaving a large, square opening in the center of the room. This was the heart of the home. Around this opening, he and the children carefully placed the stones they had collected, building a low, circular wall to contain the rising heat and steam. The day he finished, a profound quiet fell over their small valley. The last log was placed. The last stone was set. He stood back, his body a single, continuous ache, and looked at what they had made. It was not beautiful. The walls were uneven, the roof was shaggy, but it was theirs. He pushed open the heavy, ill-fitting door he had fashioned from split planks and ushered the children inside. The difference was instantaneous. The air within the cabin was still, shielded from the ever-present wind. And from the stone-lined pit in the center of the room, a gentle, humid warmth rose, suffusing the small space with a life-giving heat. The floorboards near the pit were already warm to the touch. The steam, which would have been a nuisance outside, was a blessing here, keeping the air from becoming painfully dry. Anna walked to the center of the room and held her hands over the rising vapor. A slow smile spread across her face. Ben laid his cheek against the floorboards and closed his eyes. That night, they slept not huddled together for shared warmth, but spread out on their simple straw-tick beds, breathing the soft, warm air. Thomas lay awake for hours, listening to the sound of their peaceful breathing and the gentle hiss of the earth. He had done it. He had taken his strange notion and built a fortress against the cold. A few weeks later, with the cabin secure and a good supply of firewood stacked against the outer wall, he knew he needed supplies they couldn't forage. Flour, salt, lamp oil. He made the 2-day trek to a trading post far to the south, a place where he wasn't known. He carried 3 perfectly tanned deer hides, the result of a successful hunt and meticulous work. The storekeeper, a grim man with skeptical eyes, unrolled the hides on his counter. He ran his thumb over the supple leather, checking for imperfections. He grunted, a sound of reluctant approval. "Good work," he said, and the 2 words were a balm to Thomas's soul. "Where you hold up?" "Didn't think anyone was living up in the ridges, found a sheltered spot," Thomas replied, unwilling to share his secret. He traded the hides for his necessities and a small bag of hard candy for the children. As he started the long walk back, he noticed the sky. It was a strange, bruised yellow-gray, and the air had a dead, still quality to it. The usual sounds of the wilderness were gone. The world seemed to be holding its breath. He had seen a sky like this once before, years ago. He quickened his pace, a new urgency propelling him forward. The blizzard was coming. The first flakes were small and sparse, drifting down like idle thoughts. But within an hour, the sky had vanished, and the world had dissolved into a churning, horizontal chaos of white. The great blizzard of 1890 did not arrive, it detonated. The wind was a solid wall of sound, a shrieking, grinding roar that seemed to want to tear the cabin from its foundations. Snow piled up against the walls with astonishing speed, burying the small structure until only the peak of its earthen roof was visible. Outside, the temperature plummeted to a level that was no longer just cold, but a lethal, active force. It was a cold that could freeze a man's lungs, that could stop a heart in minutes. Any living thing caught in that maelstrom was doomed. Inside the cabin, it was another world. The wind screamed and battered the walls, but the sturdy, interlocking logs held firm. The snow, which was a deadly threat outside, became their greatest ally, piling up in thick, insulating drifts that sealed every crack and crevice, locking the precious warmth inside. Thomas and the children sat on the floor near the central stone pit, the gentle, geothermal heat rising around them. The air was warm and humid, smelling faintly of pine and damp earth. The flagstones of the pit were hot enough to heat a kettle, and a pot of thin stew bubbled merrily beside it. By the steady, yellow light of their single lantern, Anna was reading from a tattered primer, her voice a small, clear counterpoint to the storm's fury. Ben was meticulously arranging a line of pebbles on a warm floorboard, creating a silent, orderly world of his own. Thomas watched them, a feeling of profound, aching gratitude washing over him. He saw not just their safety, but their peace. They were not terrified, huddled in the dark and praying for deliverance. They were home. He thought of Marcus and Helen in their drafty farmhouse, with its huge, hungry fireplace that devoured wood and gave back so little warmth. He thought of the town, of the other families in their conventional, vulnerable houses. They would be fighting the cold right now, a desperate, losing battle. Here, in this place built from a rejected idea, they were not fighting at all. They were living in harmony with a power they had been clever enough to embrace. The earth itself was their hearth. The blizzard was not their enemy, it was just weather, an external event that had no purchase on their small, warm sanctuary. He had not just saved his children from the cold. He had given them a world where the cold did not matter. For 3 days, the world ceased to exist beyond their 4 walls. The storm raged without pause, a monolithic display of nature's power. They lost all sense of day and night, marking time only by the need to eat and sleep. The cabin was their entire universe, a warm, breathing space suspended in a maelstrom of white noise. On the 4th day, Thomas noticed a change. The constant, high-pitched shriek of the wind had subsided into a low, guttural moan. The fury was lessening. It was sometime in what he guessed was the afternoon when he heard it. At first, he thought it was a trick of the wind, a strange harmony in the storm's dying howl. But then it came again. A faint, rhythmic thumping against the door. It was a sound so improbable, so alien to their isolation, that he froze. Anna looked up from her book, her eyes wide. Ben stopped his game with the pebbles. The sound came again, weaker this time, more desperate. A knock. Someone was out there. In this. It was impossible. No one could survive in that storm for an hour, let alone days. Thomas grabbed the lantern and moved to the door. It was jammed shut by a deep drift of snow. He put his shoulder to it and heaved, the wood groaning in protest. He pushed again, with all his strength, and the door scraped open a few inches, letting in a blast of frigid air and a swirl of fine, powdery snow. A figure was slumped against the opening, a grotesque sculpture of ice and frost. It was a man, so covered in snow that he was barely recognizable as human. He wore the remnants of a heavy coat, and his face was a mask of frozen beard and desperate, pleading eyes. The man collapsed forward into the room, falling onto the warm floorboards with a soft thud. Thomas quickly shoved the door closed, sealing them back inside their warmth. He knelt beside the figure, holding the lantern close. As the ice on the man's beard began to melt, Thomas saw the face beneath. It was Marcus. His brother-in-law. His accuser. The man who had sent him and his children out into the wilderness to die. He was barely conscious, his lips blue and cracked, his breathing shallow and ragged. He looked around the small, warm cabin, his eyes glazed with disbelief. He looked at the children, safe and calm. He looked at the impossible, steaming pit in the center of the floor. And then his eyes found Thomas's. The roof, he rasped, his voice a dry whisper of sound. The barn roof, it came down. All the wood, buried. We're freezing, Thomas. Helen, the children, they're freezing. The moment hung in the warm, humid air of the cabin. The storm moaned outside. The stew bubbled on the hot stones. The children watched, their faces unreadable. Here was the man who had condemned them, now kneeling on the floor of their salvation, begging for his life and the lives of his family. It was a moment ripe for vengeance, for a bitter, righteous satisfaction. Thomas felt the pull of it, a dark, cold satisfaction that whispered in the back of his mind. He could close the door. He could let the storm finish the work it had started. It would be justice. But then he looked at his own children, at Anna's wide, questioning eyes and Ben's silent stillness. What would they learn from that kind of justice? What kind of man would it make him, to mirror the cruelty he had been shown? He saw his wife's face in his memory, not with shame this time, but with clarity. She had been a woman of profound, quiet kindness. Vengeance was not her way, and it would not be his. The choice was not a choice at all. It was an inevitability, dictated by the man he had decided to be. He moved without a word. He helped Marcus sit up, propping him against the wall. He ladled a cup of hot broth from the pot and held it to his brother-in-law's lips. Marcus drank greedily, the warmth spreading through him, his shivering slowly subsiding. Thomas then went to his own meager stores. He packed a sack with dried meat, a small bag of flour, and a bundle of fatwood kindling that would light even in the dampest conditions. He gave Marcus his own spare pair of woolen mittens. He didn't offer comfort or forgiveness. He offered a strategy. "Your farmhouse is a cold box," he said, his voice level and practical. "You cannot heat the whole thing. Choose one room. The smallest one. Hang every blanket you have over the door and the window. Seal the cracks with rags. Live in that room only." He sketched a diagram on a piece of bark with a bit of charcoal from the edge of the pit. "The snow is deep, but it's an insulator. There are fallen logs on the south-facing slope of the first ridge. The wood on the underside will be dry. Dig for it. It will be hard work, but it is there." Marcus stared at him, his face a mixture of awe, confusion, and a deep, gut-wrenching shame. "Why?" he managed to choke out. Thomas looked at Anna and Ben, then back at the man who had so carelessly gambled with their lives. "Helen is my wife's sister," he said simply. "Her children are their cousins. That is the only reason you need." When the blizzard finally broke, the world was remade. It was a landscape of impossible, sculptural beauty and profound, silent death. The sun shone on a sea of white, the glare so bright it hurt the eyes. Thomas helped Marcus fashion a pair of rough snowshoes from pine boughs and sent him on his way, a small, dark figure moving slowly across the vast, unbroken snowfield, following the instructions that would save his family. The weeks that followed were a slow awakening. The news that trickled through the valleys was grim. Entire herds of cattle, frozen standing in the fields. Families found huddled in their homes, having lost the battle against the cold. The blizzard had been a great reaping, a brutal test that had broken many. But the story of Marcus's family, who had survived in their sealed room, burning dry wood dug from beneath the snow, began to spread. And with it, the even more impossible story of the man who had told him how to do it. The man who lived on the forsaken ridges, in a cabin that was warm all winter without a fire. At first, it was a trickle. A lone rider, a surveyor mapping the territory, who followed the unfrozen creek out of curiosity and stumbled upon the cabin. He stood in the doorway, his mouth agape, scribbling notes in a leather-bound book. He called Thomas an innovator, a genius of practical engineering. Then came others. A neighboring rancher who had lost half his herd, coming to see the place with his own eyes. He did not understand the geology, but he understood warmth. He understood survival. He looked at Thomas with a new respect, a deference that had been unthinkable months before. One day, Marcus returned. He did not ride up to the cabin. He walked, leading a milk cow with a small calf trailing behind. He carried a heavy sack over his shoulder. He did not knock. He simply stood outside, waiting to be seen. When Thomas came to the door, Marcus gestured to the cow and dropped the sack on the ground. It was full of new tools, a sharp felling axe, a proper wood saw, a draw knife. He met Thomas's eyes for a brief moment. He said nothing. No apology was offered, and none was needed. The apology was in the cow. It was in the tools. It was a silent, profound admission of a debt that could never be repaid with words. Thomas simply nodded, and Marcus turned and walked away. The reconciliation was as quiet and solid as the cabin itself. The cabin over the hot spring became more than a home. It became a landmark, a legend whispered around campfires and pot-bellied stoves across the territory. It was known as the warm place, and its builder, the quiet man who had been cast out for his strange ideas, became a figure of grudging admiration, and then, of genuine respect. His name was Thomas, and he knew how to listen to the land. The years passed. Anna and Ben grew up in that small, warm room, their world shaped not by scarcity and fear, but by ingenuity and resilience. They learned to read the rocks, to understand the hidden language of the water, to see the world not as a hostile force to be conquered, but as a complex system of challenges and opportunities. Thomas taught them that knowledge was not a decoration for the mind, but a tool for living, the most fundamental tool of all. He showed them how a consistent method, repeated over time, could achieve what brute force never could. They were not raised to be farmers who fought the earth, but caretakers who partnered with it. Other families, emboldened by his success, began to settle in the higher valleys. They learned from him, seeking his advice on where to dig a well, how to situate a house to catch the winter sun, how to read the signs of the seasons. He never hoarded his knowledge. He gave it freely, understanding that a community of competent, resilient people was a far greater defense against hardship than any single fortified home. The cabin itself became a kind of schoolhouse, a physical proof that what looks like a weakness, a strange curiosity, a refusal to conform, can become a source of unimaginable strength. It was a testament to the idea that being rejected can be a beginning, a forced departure onto a path that leads to a place you were always meant to find. And as you sit here now, in your own world, surrounded by your own comforts and your own challenges, it's worth asking, what hidden springs lie beneath the surface of your own life? What strange notions have you been told to discard? What knowledge have you gathered that seems useless until the blizzard comes? Because the story of Thomas and his children is not just a tale of survival from a bygone era. It is a timeless lesson. It reminds us that the greatest resources we have are not always the ones we can see and count, but the invisible currents of curiosity, resilience, and the quiet, stubborn courage to build a better system, right over the very ground that was supposed to be barren. If this story of turning hardship into a legacy resonated with you, consider subscribing. There are more stories like this, of quiet grit and unexpected triumphs, waiting to be told.